Welcome to Exhumed, an underground retrospective of arts and culture in the late 20th century. I'm James Wallace. In this episode, we're going to see what happens when alternative music hits the mainstream. Then the breakthrough happened. Nevermind began climbing the charts on the success of their song, Smells Like Teen Spirit. This anthem seemed to capture a feeling that was lurking beneath the surface of the culture. The iconic video had the band playing in a high school gym to moshing students, cheerleaders, and an old caretaker. This song lost the sounds of the 80s underground into the mainstream. It took a shotgun to plastic culture that everyone had been sold in the 1980s. By January 11th, 1992, Nirvana had displaced 80s icon Michael Jackson off the number one position in the charts. The flannel-clad shaggy band was integrated into the glossy presentation of MTV. Soon other bands began to rake in the success. From the ashes of Mother Love Bone, a band called Pearl Jam also started gaining immense popularity. Pearl Jam was not as punk-influenced as Nirvana, and had a rock sound that appealed more to the masses. The lyrics dealt with social issues and emotional turmoil, and for people in the mainstream, seemed very different from the good time rock lyrics that were part of their hair metal scene. Their album 10 became both popular and a critical favorite. The videos for Alive, Even Flow, and Jeremy would be in heavy rotation over the next year. The sensitive frontman, Eddie Vedder, became an archetype that many a frat boy would emulate. Flannel shirt, long hair, cargo shorts, Doc Martens, and a soul patch or goatee. Seattle itself came on the map as a place that was recognized as a music mecca. Some bands were soon able to benefit from this new attention placed on the Washington Capitol. Within a year, Alice in Chains would climb the charts with the 1992 album Dirt. Mudhoney, with their gritty garage rock dirgy sound, were actually getting some sales as well. Other bands such as Grunge, Tad, and Love Battery got some attention, but not necessarily the sales. The wake of Nirvana's success heightened the whole interest in alternative music in general. The Red Hot Chili Peppers became even more popular with the release of Blood, Sex, Magic in 1991. On tour, Pearl Jam opened for them, along with another band that was not appreciated by the crowd at the time, called the Smashing Pumpkins. We will hear more about them later. In 1992, the second Lollapalooza festival was held. It was even more massive than the first one. The Red Hot Chili Peppers headlined, and grunge giants Pearl Jam and Soundgarden were on the bill. Other acts such as Ministry, Jesus and Mary Chain, Lush, and Ice Cube were also part of the lineup, but clearly the focus was on the rising grunge bands and the Chili Peppers. Jane's Addiction's Perry Farrell was still the one behind the festival and had this vision of bringing alternative music to the mainstream. And now it was serious business. One band that was able to become really successful at that time was the Smashing Pumpkins. This Chicago-based band was able to refine the quiet, loud dynamics that Nirvana had borrowed from the Pixies and give it big production. Leader Billy Corgan took the teen angst and irony in Nirvana's lyrics and presented them in a way that were more palpable to the public. And then the imitators started to appear. The first of these was Stone Temple Pilots, a band based out of San Diego, previously known as Mighty Joe Young. Their 1992 album, Core, took elements from the grunge sound and put it into a more mainstream form. The low-tone gnarl that had been used to describe the vocal style of Alice in Chains singer Lane Stanley, and especially Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder, was imitated effectively by Stone Temple Pilots frontman Scott Weiland. Over the course of the decade, the gnarl would become the standard for rock vocalists, and more overtly commercialized versions of the sound will be spawned in the form of Creed and, yikes, Nickelback. However, many of the original fans of alternative music were becoming disillusioned. Seeing the high school jock types who'd only a year ago have been listening to MC Hammer, but were now wearing flannel and donning other aspects of the grunge uniform, made it look like the music had really lost that edge that had been so attractive to so many people in the first place. I know Personally, watching those who've been stalwart supporters of Skid Row and Poison praise the sensitivity of Eddie Vedder left me with a bad taste in my mouth. So what's a music geek to do? They begin to scan the underground to find music to call their own. And that is what happened. Many people look to indie rock. Bands like Fugazi, The Jesus Lizard, Polvo, Unwound, the now defunct Slint, and Drive Like Jehu started getting more notice. This music was more experimental, abstract, and atonal than anything in the grunge category. Other bands like Pavement, Guided by Voices, and Sebadoh would often use sparse and primitive recording methods to get a gritty sound, like it was recorded in your parents' basement. Critics would dub this production lo-fi. Horn-rimmed, glass-wearing music purists could listen to these sounds and feel a sense of superiority to those who were simply getting their cues from MTV. Kurt Cobain was thrust into the spotlight, and his world changed at a rapid pace. He found himself as a spokesman for a generation, but he tried to tell everyone that he simply did not have the answers they were looking for. He was at award shows with the mainstream artists that he despised. Front cover of the Rolling Stone and world tours were part of his life. He wanted success, but he was not ready to be such a pivotal figure in rock history. His public and turbulent marriage to Courtney Love was splashed all over the pages of the rock press and tabloids. The band's follow-up to Nevermind, In Utero, was produced by Big Black leader and miscreant producer Steve Albini. The mix had the rawness that would be appreciated by the indie rock and lo-fi music fans. However, the record company could simply not accept the raw indie-sounding mix and insist that the album be remixed. Worse still, heroin addiction was taking over Kurt's life. On a European tour in Italy, he overdosed on pills and champagne. And in April 1994, Kurt Cobain committed suicide with a shotgun. This event is arguably one of the most pivotal events in the history of rock music. That is largely because it is seen as the end of rock music as a genre of rebellion, as a cultural force that young people would believe in to change the world. As seen in the last episode, Nirvana's success was the final stage in a long lineage of music going back decades and nurtured by underground music scenes. But their breakthrough was an accident, an event that no record company executive could have foreseen. Now everything that was permeating the mainstream was carefully packaged and promoted. Nirvana's demise was the demise of rock as a force that gives us meaning. Nirvana drummer Dave Grohl would create the more commercially sounding Foo Fighters and would cement his place within the rock mainstream. In the fall of 1994, two bands started climbing the charts, Green Day and The Offspring. Both of these bands came out of the Southern California pop punk scene. Punk had always had an element of traditional pop music in it, and in many ways, some punk bands were trying to take music back to the singles eras of the mid-60s before the psychedelic indulgence took over. Bands like the Buzzcocks and Northern Ireland's The Undertones used saccharine melodies sung over distorted guitars. In the 1980s, numerous bands would emerge from California that took their cues from these melodic British bands. The Descendants, Bad Religion, the Mr. T Experience, Screeching Weasel, Pennywise, and Big Drill Car. The fast beats of hardcore punk merged with pop vocals that fans could sing along to. Many of these bands were on the labels Lookout and Epitaph. In the wake of Nirvana's success, both Bad Religion and Green Day signed to major labels. Green Day's Dookie became a major success in 1994, and the hits Basket Case, Longview, and When I Come Around went into heavy MTV and commercial radio rotation. The Offspring, still signed to Epitaph Records, had massive hits with their singles Come Out and Play, Self-Esteem, and Gotta Get Away. The combination of simple pop melodies, obvious teen angst lyrics, and well-produced yet distorted guitars created an easily digestible form of teen rebellion that the mainstream loved. The metaphorical dark cynicism of Nirvana was put into a glossy format that emphasized teen culture. Despite having emerged from a punk hardcore underground, there was nothing rebellious about this music. It was the antithesis of Black Flag or Bad Brains. By the time the band Blink-182 climbed the charts in 1999, the sound was so clean that it was only a few degrees removed from Britney Spears. Like with the skinny tie bands of the late 70s, early 80s, the sound of punk was tamed and packaged for the average consumer. To walk around in the early 80s with piercings, tattooed, and dyed hair was considered to be a dangerous sport. As Social Distortion's frontman Mike Ness would state, we could get beat up by jocks, rednecks, and cops. However, by 1992, these subversive alterations of appearances were becoming an integral part of the mainstream alternative culture. High-quality tattoos were showing up on the bodies of young people. Young men bleached and dyed their hair numerous colors. Piercings of the most uncomfortable kind were now being displayed in the name of individuality. This mainstreaming of social practices were part of the fringe, reflected in the artists that were entering the spotlight. Industrial music is a genre that uses ugly sounds from the real world in a musical way. It has its roots in 20th century composers like Karlheinz Stockhausen, John Cage, and Edgar Varese, but the label was applied to artists in the late 70s and early 80s, such as Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, Test Department, and Einstürzende Neubauten. As the genre evolved, electronic beats, synthesizers, and samples became an integral part of the music, as reflected in artists like Skinny Puppy and Front 242. The band Ministry would start incorporating heavy distorted guitars and created a powerful metallic album in 1989, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. One man would take this combination of rock guitars and industrial sampling to the mainstream, Trent Reznor. His band, Nine Inch Nails, crafted a more commercially friendly version of Ministry's sound and would hit massive mainstream success with their 1994 album, The Downward Spiral. Lyrics involved self-hatred, nihilism, obsession, and overt sexual desire permeated this industrial rock sound, and Reznor found himself a darling of the mainstream press. The fringe sounds that once could only hear in goth clubs were now features in Rolling Stone. However, an emaciated ivory-skinned demon would take this sound and push the shock value, Marilyn Manson. Fusing the names of a sex symbol and a serial killer as his moniker, Marilyn Manson, who like Alice Cooper was both a person and a band, created a persona that fused the androgyny of David Bowie with the demonic appearance of Gene Simmons. The sound took its cues from Reznor's and would reference goth, electronic, and metal. The lyrics and live shows were there to shock parents. Sexuality, violence, suicide, and even the kind of satanic references that were the domain of extreme metal were all contained within his songs, along with heavy doses of sarcasm and irony. In the underground scenes of punk, metal, industrial, and goth, these sounds and ideas had been explored before, but it had never been promoted to the masses in this way. The band's CDs, Antichrist Superstar and Mechanical Animals, were being consumed by suburban mall-dwelling youth. A controversy would strike when two teenagers, who maybe listened to Marilyn Manson, committed a mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado at their high school in 1999. Even though he condemned the violence committed by these two young men, the blame was directed his way. As a result of this backlash, Manson would never be at the same level of fame. But what Manson's rise to popularity showed was mainstream record companies could even take sounds of the underground fringe and make them marketable on MTV. A band would emerge in the early 90s that would take direct aim at the injustices of capitalism, Rage Against the Machine. Now, there had been a long history of music backing the proletariat worker against the bourgeoisie, going right back to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. Punk rock bands had a noted history of sticking it to the man. While major label artists like The Clash and even Pink Floyd had scathing critiques of capitalism on their albums, many bands in the underground were critical of these artists as being part of the corporate superstructure. Bands like the Dead Kennedys and Crass would release albums on their own labels and felt having the means of production in their own hands liberating. Unfortunately, for most bands taking this approach, poverty and limited exposure was the result. but they had the loyalty of the fans and the underground scene they occupied. Rage Against the Machine was formed in 1991 out of the ashes of glam funk metal band Lockup and hardcore punks Inside Out. The sound fused together metal with the groove of funk and hip hop. Singer Zach De La Rocha used an aggressive rap-style delivery, which flowed over the hypnotic grooves of the rhythm section. The guitarist, Tom Morello, used the pickups and volume control of his guitar to emulate the record-scratching techniques of hip-hop DJs. The lyrics highlighted the social injustice of historic and current racism, U.S. foreign policy, and the crimes of the free market. This powerful sound started playing on regular rotation with the foul language censored out. While the band gave exposure to issues such as the controversial incarcerations of Mumia Abdul-Jamal and Leonard Peltier, they had many critics. Their revolutionary socialist message was being promoted by the Sony Corporation, a multinational conglomerate. People like Ian Mackay of Fugazi pointed out the fact they say they are against capitalism when the company they work for exemplifies greedy capitalism. Mackay had been running Discord Records out of a house since the early 80s and had direct control over the means of production, including the price of CDs and concert tickets. But Morello would point out this to his critics. When you live in a capitalistic society, the currency of dissemination of information goes through capitalistic channels. Would Noam Chomsky get to his work being sold at Barnes & Noble? No, because that's where people buy the books. We're not interested in preaching to just the converted. It's great to play abandoned squats run by anarchists, but it's also great to be able to reach people with revolutionary message, people from Granada Hills to Stuttgart. But what the situation with Rage Against the Machine showed is that corporations are fine selling anti-capitalist messages to the public as long as it contributes to the capitalistic bottom line. Killing in the Name was just as much a frat boy anthem as it was a call to revolution, and most importantly, it made money. Taking their cues from Rage Against the Machine's fusion of rock, metal, and hip-hop emerged a slew of bands that would dominate the scenes of the late 90s and early 2000s. Korn, Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park, Stained, Static X, and Kid Rock. Hip-hop clothing, down-tuned guitars, and big production were part of the formula, along with the very standard verse, chorus, and bridges. Lyrics dealt with teen angst, political incorrect attitude, and in Limp Bizkit's case, the kind of misogyny found in gangster rap. Many of these bands appealed to white suburban males who liked to speak in ebonics and tried to prove their street cred. One of the more creative acts in this genre, the Deftones, invoked the melodies of the Smiths and the Cure. Nu metal was marketed rebellion in a package that used the imagery that was ever present in the ubiquitous teen culture of the late 90s. The big production of these bands were the antithesis of the lo-fi sound. This sound was MTV and the suburban mall, and it was often hated by true metalheads as much as hair metal had been in the late 1980s, and most people could see that they were being sold a package. As the 10th year anniversary of Nirvana's Nevermind approached, music critics scoured to find the next band that would lead the new rock revolution. While Radiohead's 1997 epic OK Computer did have quite an impact artistically on a cultural level, there had been no absolute game changer like Nevermind. But the critics thought that they had found a band that could save rock and bring forth the dawning of a new age, the Strokes. This New York quartet were students of the city's musical history and took their sound from the great bands of CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, the Velvet Underground, the Modern Lovers, and Television. A massive bidding war began between the labels, and when their debut album came out in the summer of 2001, it was aptly titled, Is This It? The band themselves knew there was no way they could live up to the hype. No one could. And while the album sold very well, it did not create the new revolution like Nirvana had. The reason for this failure was that Nirvana was a happy accident that stood on the shoulders of generations of music that had been brewing in the independent scenes all over North America. The Strokes were being forced into trying to create a revolution that wasn't going to happen. While the popularity of the Strokes did pave the way for the success of bands like the White Stripes, the Hives, Arcade Fire, and Franz Ferdinand, as mentioned earlier, Nirvana was really rock music's last stand as a cultural force for change. It became apparent by the millennium that the corporations had won, and that the raw power that Nirvana had evoked in the early 90s were now a slight echo. While there were bands that played all kinds of rock genres all over the world, there would be nothing like Nirvana again. Over the course of the new millennium, rock music was being overtaken by hip-hop, electronic dance music, girl diva singers, and boy bands. Even those who were connected to the rock genre had a sound so artificial and cleaned up it could hardly pass for rock music. I'm thinking Avril Lavigne or even Maroon 5. But one positive aspect of consuming music in the new millennium was the availability of music on the internet. Young people can not only easily discover Nirvana, but they can discover the bands that influenced them. Like people who are getting into classical music discover Bach, then Mozart, then Beethoven, or new jazz fans find the pathway that goes from Louis Armstrong all the way to John Coltrane. Nirvana fans are learning about Sonic Youth, Black Flag, and the Stooges. The revolution is long over, but there is a legacy that anyone can still unearth. Thank you for listening to Exhumed. Join us next episode when I speak with Dr. Jason Riddler about our experiences listening to underground music in the late 80s and early 90s. Take care.